Welcome to today's lecture. Today we shall be discussing about an overview on modern cryptography. So as we have introduced the topic, today's discussion will be essentially about achieving the following objectives. Today we shall try to understand what are the goals of cryptography and what are the security services which are intended by cryptographers, to provide to users, and also what are the mechanisms which are adopted to realize these services. And finally, we shall conclude with some comments about the relationships between the services and the mechanisms. So throughout the course we shall actually go deeper into these topics, but today's lecture essentially shall be trying to understand, or rather obtain an overview on the subject. So first of all, what are the three main goals of cryptography? So you see that essentially, as we say it to be CIA, that is confidentiality, integrity and availability. So the goals are essentially as follows, like hiding the information from unauthorized access, that is a person or user who is not authorized to use a particular piece of information should not be able to access the information. And integrity of data is important, that is the information should be prevented from modification by a person who is not authorized to do so. So we all know that we always do modification of data. For example, in a bank, in a bank scenario, where we are essentially try to kind of debit an account or credit an account, then we are kind of continuously changing our balances. But imagine, like, if instead of me updating my bank account, somebody else does. So that is not proper, right? So that's an illegal use. So cryptography also tries to provide the integrity of the information which is there in my bank account. So that is what is meant by integrity. And the other important thing is availability. So therefore, while doing all these, or rather while taking measures to achieve the goals of confidentiality and integrity, we should not make it so clumsy, like the network should not be, nor the communication should not be so clumsy that the information is not accessible to the authorized user. So by saying that it is not accessible, or it's rather it's not available easily, means that it may become very slow. For example, you are accessing a particular information and are trying to access a particular information, and imagine that it is so slow that you cannot access it. So therefore it's not usable. Okay. So therefore the objective of cryptography is to provide confidentiality and integrity of data while maintaining the availability of information to an authorized user. So now we shall consider the typical scenario of a cryptographic network. So therefore there are essentially two users, or as we say as legal users or authorized users. Consider Bob and Alice. As we have discussed in the last class, they are the two most popular characters which are used to describe a cryptographic scenario. And they send an information like, suppose, dear Alice, and there is an eavesdropper who is unauthorized to obtain the information. So the eavesdropper essentially has got an access to the communication channel, and therefore what is believed in this network, or rather in this setting, is that this communication channel is not trusted. So it's an untrusted communication channel through which Bob and Alice tries to communicate a piece of information. So the goals which cryptography tries to provide are, as we have discussed, confidentiality, integrity and availability of information. That means Eve should not have an access to this information, so it should be some sort of unintelligible to the Eve, and at the same time it should not be able to modify this piece of information, like instead of saying dear Alice, it should not be something else, so that there is a kind of misunderstanding between Bob and Alice. And at the same time, Alice should be able to access this piece of information easily. So it should not be like the network becomes so slow or the packet is dropped, in order to prevent it from being accessed by Eve, and in the process not ending up in Alice not being able to access the piece of information. So that should not happen. So the piece of information should also be available to Alice. So that is these are the basic three broad goals which cryptography tries to provide to users, and we have to see that what are the mechanisms that cryptography or network security or this subject essentially kind of provides to achieve these informations, or these goals. So now we shall little bit look more deeply into each of these topics. So we can see, for example, confidentiality. So confidentiality is essentially where the information is exchanged over untrusted networks. As we have said just now, that the information is being exchanged over untrusted network, and we have to provide confidentiality in such a setting. and so therefore the information while exchanged should remain secret. So therefore when we are kind of exchanging a piece of information, then it should not be kind of opened up to a person who is not supposed to use this information. And at the same time, confidential related to both the storage as well as transmission of information, which means that it is not only like when we are storing a piece of information, but confidentiality has to be provided in transit. That is, when the message is being passed from, say, Alice or Bob over an untrusted network, it should be confidential, and it should not be opened up to a person like Eve, okay, who is not authorized to use the piece of information. So then comes the topic of integrity, as we have discussed. So we know that information is always changing. The basic objective of having information is, one of the objectives is like to kind of modify this information. So information is always transient, right? So but the changes should be made by only the authorized user. So imagine like there is, I do a railway booking, or for example I do, as I said, that I have a bank account, and these information should be only changed by the people who are authorized to do so. But what we term in this literature as modification means that change which is made by unauthorized users. So therefore these unauthorized users can be given names of various names, like it could be like attackers, it could be hackers, it could be people who are kind of trying to sabotage this piece of information by modifying. Okay, so for example, I have a bank account and somebody else kind of continuously extracts out money out of it. So that is a piece of modification which needs to be stopped. So therefore we need techniques to ensure the integrity of data. So that encompasses essentially two parts, like it should be kind of prevented, I mean the unauthorized user should be prevented from modifying this piece of information, and also if somebody does any modification, the second line is like I should be at least able to detect that a modification has taken place, and kind of trying to identify that who has made this modification. So these are kind of the two important goals which essentially needs to be satisfied by cryptography, and is needed by any form of e-commerce or electronic transaction. So these are very important goals which cryptography needs to satisfy. So then, as I told you, that confidentiality and integrity should not hinder the availability of data. So data must be continuously available to an authorized user, and cryptographic mechanisms will definitely have an overhead. So it is always like you are doing something over what you are supposed to do for the normal transaction, but the overhead should be as small as possible. So therefore cryptography should not be a nuisance so much that it is kind of bypassed for practical usage. So therefore we need kind of fast algorithms, faster modification techniques, something which has got a lesser footprint over time and other important parameters. So then we come to the topic, I mean, how are these goals achieved? So therefore the mechanisms. So we see that cryptographic algorithms needs to be designed to achieve these goals, and what we say is that what is very central to cryptography is like they rely on a piece of information which is known as the secret key. So therefore the idea is as follows, that is, everybody knows the algorithms. The algorithms are existing in public domain. What does not exist or what is not known to an attacker is a piece of information which we know as or call as the key. Okay, so therefore the objective of any attacker is essentially to find out the key. So therefore if he or she is able to find out the key, is able to deduce the key by an efficient technique, then the cryptographic algorithm is supposed to be compromised, and then the various goals which cryptographic algorithms kind of guarantees like confidentiality, integrity and availability are does not hold anymore, because the basic algorithm on which these goals, or rather through which these goals are achieved, are compromised by these attacks. So therefore we have to consider cryptographic attacks. So therefore when we are designing a cryptographic algorithm, then we have to consider the attacks. Okay, and this is a very fascinating part of this subject. And one of the primary reasons is that we do not know what an attacker can do. So therefore we essentially do not have proper, I mean it's difficult to develop a proper model of an attacker, and that makes the subject quite interesting, because you are supposed to develop a cryptographic algorithm which is secured against an algorithm or a concept which we called as an attacker who is not properly defined. So the first thing which we do is that we try to properly understand, or rather we can try to kind of conceptualize what are the possible types of attacks which can take place. So we, for example, we can kind of broadly categorize the attacks as two parts. Like we can say like one of the parts is called what we call as cryptanalytic attacks. So what is cryptanalysis? So as we will be seeing that this particular discourse or this particular subject has got two important components. One of them is what we call as cryptography, which is the science of making ciphers or cryptographic algorithms, and the other is the science of breaking ciphers. And this science, which kind of discusses how to compromise existing ciphers, is technically known as cryptanalysis. And together with cryptography and cryptanalysis, the subject is called cryptology. So there are some attacks which essentially are which belong to this category of cryptanalytic attacks, which essentially tries to find out, or rather applies mathematical techniques to find out the weaknesses of existing cryptographic algorithms. Now it may be noted that the objective of cryptanalysis is, when we are doing a study, is not bad. So the objective is kind of to make our defenses stronger, right? So we can make a strong cryptographic algorithm only if we analyze the cryptographic algorithm quite deeply, so that a third person or an illegal user is not able to kind of find out the weaknesses. So we are kind of trying to find out, or be rather we are trying to kind of develop a cryptographic algorithm which through which we can actually guarantee security to an user. But that is quite difficult, but that is the objective or the goal of this subject. And so therefore we find that in cryptanalytic attacks we apply mathematical techniques to obtain the key better than a brute force search. So therefore consider that in a practical scenario you may have a for example a cryptographic algorithm which has, say, a 128-bit key. So 128-bit key means that, say, suppose you can imagine that it's a 0-1 value, and therefore there are 2 to the power of 128 possible values of the key. Okay, so what we can do, or what an attacker can do, is, for example, try all these 2 to the power of 128 possibilities. Okay, so that is something which we call as a brute force search. So it's nothing, I mean, it does not take care or rather take or exploit the properties of the cryptographic algorithm, but just searches all the possible keys. But as we know that 2 to the power of 128 is a huge number. Okay, it's probably more than the number of particles in this universe. Okay, so therefore it is not possible for a bounded adversary, or what we say as a practical adversary or a practical attacker to search for all the possible keys. Okay, but that is, I mean, the goal of a cryptographic algorithm is first of all to to guarantee that an attack does not exist which is better than a brute force search. Okay, so now if an attack is developed, for example, talking about our 128-bit key, if I develop an attack against a cryptographic algorithm which requires, say, 2 to the power of 127 searches, okay, so technically speaking it's still an impractical attack, but we will classify them as an attack, and we will see that we will say that the cryptographic algorithm is technically compromised. Okay, so therefore we will try to develop techniques so that even such an attack does not exist. The reason being that, okay, this attack may not be practical today, but it may be exploited to develop further attacks. So therefore the objective of, or rather the principle which is followed in the designing of in the subject of designing ciphers is to develop a cryptographic algorithm, to state the algorithm properly, rather formally, and then trying to find out various methods through which it can be attacked, and then to guarantee that, or rather to kind of give proper arguments, mathematical arguments, to say that an attack does not exist which is better than a brute force search. So that's the objective of the subject which we call as cryptanalysis. So we will see that all attackers, or rather all attacks, are essentially distinguishers. So what we mean by distinguishers is that all good ciphers, that is supposedly which are ciphers which are good, transforms a plain text distribution to appear as random. So which means that suppose we take a normal cryptographic algorithm and apply it over alphabetic text. Okay, so therefore I use English language text, and that is what we call as the plain text, and we apply my cryptographic algorithm to kind of develop something which I call as the cipher or the cipher text. So now you see that we know that as we will see in our future classes, is that English language distribution, you will find that has got a particular distribution. So we know that, for example, E is the most popular letter which we use in our normal English literature. So these type of properties exist in the language that I speak. Okay, and the objective of a good cipher, or rather a good cipher, should make this distribution look random to a person who is just observing the output. Okay, that is what I mean is that I take a plain text, I take for example a plain text, and I know that there is a distinct distribution in that plain text. Okay. Now the objective of a ciphering algorithm should be to make this distribution lost. Okay. So that means the distribution of the cipher text should look random. Okay. But it will be noted that since a ciphering algorithm is kind of a sequence of mathematical steps, it can never be random. Okay. It can at best be something which we call as pseudo-random. So it is something like it is hard to distinguish from a random, but it is definitely not random. Okay. So now the objective of an attacker or a cryptanalytic attacker or cryptanalysis is to find properties, so basically to study the cipher and to find properties which still exist in the cipher text, which makes it distinguished from a random distribution. Okay. So the moment I find such a property, then I can exploit that or use that to develop a real life attack. Okay. So what we can do is that once we have this kind of property, we guess a portion of the key, and then we see whether that property exists in the cipher text. Okay. And the hypothesis is that if the key is wrong, then that property does not exist, but if the key is correct, then the property exists. Okay. And that can give a kind of distinguisher between a wrong key and a correct key. So therefore the objective of a cryptanalytic of a cryptanalysis procedure would be typically to find out these properties, and then to develop a kind of divide and conquer technique to find out, or rather to kind of distinguish a wrong key from a correct key. So we will see this concept in more details when we talk about linear cryptanalysis and differential cryptanalysis. But the message which I want to convey is that all cryptanalytic attacks, or all attacks in general, are nothing but distinguishers. Either they are distinguishers from a random distribution. Okay. So you see that so all good ciphers transform the plaintext distribution to appear as random. The goal of an attack is to find properties in the cipher which does not exist in a random distribution. So the attacker then guesses a portion of the key and checks for the property. So therefore the attacker basically guesses a portion of the key and checks whether the property exists. And any attack which is better than a brute force search, so therefore as I told you that any attack which is better than a brute force search, like if it's better than 2 power of 128, so it could be 2 power of 127, even then it qualifies as an attack. So it may not be practical attack, but it definitely exposes a design flaw. So it says that the designer of this particular cryptographic algorithm gave me a security of 128 bits, but what it is achieving actually is, say, a security of 127 bits. So it may be still sufficient for the real life scenario, but it definitely exposes a design flaw which can be exploited with further developments in cryptanalysis. So therefore it needs to be taken care of. Then there are an array of non-cryptanalytic attacks. So they do not expose the mathematical weaknesses of the cryptographic algorithms, but they kind of attack, or rather threat the way or the protocols which are adopted in a typical network kind of scenario. So they also kind of threat to confidentiality, integrity and availability. So as we see that under security attacks, there are kind of two attacks which are known as snooping attacks and traffic analysis. Then we have got modification, masquerading, replaying, repudiation and denial of service. So I will come to these topics gradually. So we see that so therefore if I concentrate on the threat to confidentiality part, there are kind of two types of attacks. One is called snooping and the other one is called traffic analysis. So what snooping does is, the snooping refers to unauthorized access or interception of information. Okay, so therefore if you just think of the Bob and Alice kind of scenario, when Bob was kind of transferring a message over to Alice, and if Eve obtains this information of dear Alice, that is the information which was being passed over the communication channel, then we say that Eve is snooping over the communication channel. So what is normally done is that this message of dear Alice is encrypted. Okay, so therefore it is made unintelligible, so that even if Eve has an access to this network, he or she does not understand the content of the information. Okay, so therefore encryption is used to make information non-intelligible to the snooper, and it does not have an idea about what is the actual content which is being transferred. The other thing is that even if cryptographic algorithms like encryption is being adopted and it is made unintelligible to Eve, Eve can kind of get certain information from the message that is being passed by doing kind of traffic analysis. For example, it can obtain the identity of the receiver and the sender. You can also understand whether, say, a message file is or a text file is being encrypted, or whether an image file is being encrypted, or say a music file is being encrypted. So it can get the nature of the content which is being transferred by, say, studying the header or doing more analysis on the packets which are being transferred. So that is what is called as the traffic analysis. And then we have got the threat to integrity. So therefore you see that so therefore under the threat to integrity, we have the topic of, or rather we have got the threat of modification. So as I told you previously, modification means that essentially the content is being kind of changed or being updated, okay, by a person who is not authorized to do so. So therefore an attacker can modify the transmitted information without actually changing the content, without actually needing to know the actual content. So therefore I can give you one example. For example, imagine that there is Alice and there is Bob who are kind of communicating, and suppose Alice wants to send to Bob a transaction of say rupees 1000, okay. So what may happen in between is that in order so that Eve is also kind of obtaining this information, and Alice or Bob does not want that Eve should understand the amount of the transaction. So what Alice does is that Alice chooses a random number. So Alice chooses K randomly, okay, so and encodes that as in a binary format. So therefore and have a binary encoding, okay, and have a binary encoding. So I call that to be something like I denote that to be K, okay. So this is actually nothing but a key which Alice generates and somehow communicates this key to Bob through a secure channel, okay. So therefore imagine that there is a secure channel through which Alice communicates this information to Bob, and that is used only once in the transaction. That is when the transaction starts, Alice communicates this piece of information to Bob. Now what Alice does is that Alice takes this 1000 number, that is also encoded in a binary format, and XORs that with the binary encoding of the key, okay, and I denote this as this is the binary encoding. So it obtains this information and just XORs that with the key. So this could be some piece of information. So 1000 XORed with the key, and I call that to be some information which is encoded in the binary format. So Eve has an access to this piece of information, right? So Eve has an access to this piece of information. So Bob, since it knows the value of this key, what Bob can do when it receives this packet is it can modify this, or rather take this 1000 binary encoded with key and XOR that with the binary encoding of key. And since we know that if I do an XOR of two same numbers, then I essentially get 0, okay, and therefore what Bob obtains back is the binary encoding of 1000, and therefore it knows the amount of the transaction. But you see that Eve has the information which Eve has an access to is this, right, is 1000 XORed with this key. But if this key is randomly chosen, so then Eve does not have a knowledge about what is this key, so it cannot actually extract this information from this information. So therefore Eve, confidentiality is maintained. So we say that confidentiality is definitely maintained, okay. So confidentiality is maintained probably by, if the key is randomly chosen, then confidentiality is guaranteed in this particular kind of is obtained using this kind of technique. But what about integrity? So you see that if I take this information like 1000 XOR key, and what Eve can do is that Eve can obtain this information, and instead of relaying back the same information, what it can do is that it can randomly generate another string k1 suppose, and just XOR this information. It just takes this, okay. So it has got this information, so it has got 1000 binary encoded XORed with k. It just takes this and XORs this with the k1 which it has generated and passes it to the Bob. So now, so if has not actually has not bothered to obtain the actual information, but it has modified the ciphertext in this fashion. So now when Bob does the decryption, Bob XORs it with this key value, and therefore what Bob obtains is so now you see that what Bob is supposed to obtain is that a transaction of ₹1000 has been taken place, but instead Bob understands that a transaction of 1000 XORed with some non-zero number which has taken place. So therefore the objective of Alice and Bob is kind of sabotaged. Okay, so therefore the integrity of the information is not really provided by this piece of by the strategy which Alice and Bob has taken. Okay, so therefore we see that for integrity you have to take or adopt something else. Okay, you have to kind of take some other mechanisms. You have to adopt some other mechanisms, and which we will be seeing in our class as we go ahead. Okay, so therefore this particular example kind of motivates us that confidentiality and integrity are two different aspects of cryptography and needs to be kind of tackled quite independently. Okay, so therefore this essentially means that for example, like an attacker who can actually modify the transmitted information without actually needing to know the actual content. So therefore, for example, here also he did not know the actual content, but it was able to modify the piece of transmitted information. Okay, so it could, for example, delay or change the content to foil the objective of a transaction, and therefore it needs to be kind of taken safeguard. Okay, so the other things could be like masquerading. So therefore an attacker, for example, can modify the communication data to pretend or something which are called as a spoof, okay, as a legal sender or a receiver to obtain the information to which it does not have an access. Okay, so for example, imagine that I am doing a transaction with a bank, okay, and when I'm accessing the bank account, it may happen that instead of being, there may be a fake kind of website which pretends to me as my bank account and does a transaction with me. Okay, so this could be a dangerous example of a masquerading. Okay, so therefore we need to adopt mechanisms to prevent such kind of attacks, security attacks. So then we have got the topic of attacks of like replaying. So therefore in this case an attacker copies a message sent by a different user and replays later. So therefore, for example, in a network kind of scenario, there is not one particular protocol which is taking place at one time, but there are multiple protocols taking place. Okay, so in one case I am the sender, in one case I am the receiver. So what can happen in a typical replay attack kind of scenario is that I obtain a piece of information and suppose I am doing a transaction 1. Okay, so consider that I am taking part in two transactions. Okay, so transaction T1 and transaction T2. So while I am kind of suppose I obtain an information in a transaction T1 and I use this piece of information to reply a particular challenge in a transaction T2. Okay, and that can essentially lead to a potential vulnerabilities in several attacks that we have seen, and this also needs to be kind of protected. So therefore we need to kind of develop strategies to prevent something which is called replay. Okay, and what is commonly adopted is like the concept of timestamps or nuances or or sequence numbers to protect against these class of attacks. So then we have got the important concept of repudiation. Okay, so what repudiation means that a sender of a message may later deny that it has actually sent it. Now this could be a dangerous thing, because for example, imagine that a user may deny a third-party payment request. For example, I do a third-party payment request, and after the transaction is done, I may deny completely that I have done this transaction. So there should be some way of proving to me later on, if I kind of take up an objection, that yes, you have actually requested this and the payment has been done as per as your request. The other scenario could be like a receiver of a data may also refuse the receipt, that it could refuse simply like it has never got this particular payment. So for example, I do a credit card transaction, and after I have transferred the money to the merchant, it may be that the merchant may refuse the receipt of the payment, and therefore it is obvious that cryptography should guarantee that such kind of scenario should not take place, or what we say is that it should guarantee non-repudiation in these kind of applications. Okay, and therefore we have to see how to or rather what are the security mechanisms, or what are the cryptographic mechanisms which provides us these concepts of repudiation or non-repudiation. So then we have got the threat to availability. So therefore, as I told you, the data must be available to to legal users. Okay, and there are some class of attacks like denial of service is a very popularly known term. So it could be like the system is so much slowed down, or it's totally disabled. Okay, that a legal user is not able to access. See, for example, like an attacker could slow down the system with multiple requests, and it could also, like, suppose consider a sender and receiver kind of scenario where the sender sends requests and does not receive the acknowledgements, so it again sends the sender. Okay, the sender again sends the request. So it could be like an attacker who is actually sitting in between the network just simply deletes the acknowledgements, and therefore the sender thinks that he is actually not receiving the acknowledgements, and therefore is again sending the requests. Okay, and this could essentially potentially crowd the network so much that the entire system is slowed down or maybe completely disabled. Okay, and therefore these kind of scenarios also needs to be tackled by various mechanisms. Okay, so therefore these also needs to be found out. So there is another taxonomy of attacks, or what we say as passive and active attacks. And so we do a classification. We again revisit these attacks and try to classify them as passive attacks or active attacks. So in a passive attack means it's a benign kind of attack. So that means that the eavesdropper or the attacker does not modify or delete the information, but just receives the information and observes the content. Okay, and while in an active attack scenario, the attacker actually modifies or deletes or inserts information. Okay, so therefore it's a potentially more harmful kind of attack modeling. And the goals, so we shall also consider the goals which are threatened. Okay, so consider snooping and traffic analysis. So this falls into the class of passive attacks, and the goal which it threatens is essentially confidentiality. Okay, so you just imagine that in an Alice and Bob kind of scenario, there is a person eavesdropper who obtains this information and tries to see what is actually going on. Okay, so therefore he tries to kind of observe the piece of the information which is being transferred. So it does not do any kind of malice by modifying or deleting or inserting the information, but just observes the content which is being transferred. So this is a typical passive attack, and it threatens the goal of confidentiality. So then we have got modification, masquerading, replaying, and repudiation. Okay, so we have seen what are these attacks, and these attacks essentially fall to under the class of active attacks because they modify, and even in masquerading you are also modifying the input packets by because in order to because we need to kind of pretend as a sender or the receiver. So we also need to kind of modify the packets by maybe planting my in place of my own identifier, I am planting the identifier of, say, another person who is legal to use the information. So that also falls under the class of active attacks because you are modifying the packet, right? You are kind of inserting some other information into the packet which you are not supposed to do. Okay, and then comes the topic of replaying and repudiation, which are obvious examples of active attacks. So these goals, or rather these attacks, essentially threaten the goal of integrity because as we have seen that the integrity or data integrity is kind of compromised by these attacks. Then the denial of service attacks, as we have seen, is also an active attack because again you are kind of deleting information by, say, deleting the acknowledgements, or you are inserting a large number of requests. Okay, so therefore you are also actively kind of attacking the network, and the goal which you are threatening is availability because information may not, under a denial of service attack, information may not be available to even a user who is authorized to use this piece of information. So these are the basic goals or rather basic attacks that we have seen, And now comes the most interesting part, like how do we achieve these goals? Okay, so therefore, what are the security services through which we essentially obtain the so what are the security services? So we will see that the various kind of security services. So one of them is data confidentiality, the other one is data integrity, authentication, non-repudiation, and access control. Okay, so now International Telecommunication Union Telecommunication Standardization Sector, which is commonly called as the ITUT, provides some security mechanisms to achieve these security services. So as we have seen the goals of data confidentiality and integrity, but and also so the three new kind of security services that we are seeing in this case is authentication, non-repudiation is also something which you have seen, and also access control. Okay, so I will go through this slowly one by one, and therefore we see that confidentiality of what the ITUT guarantees is confidentiality of part or full of the message, that is essentially to prevent spoofing and to prevent snooping and traffic analysis. Okay, so therefore these are the goals or the objective of ITUT. And also it should provide data integrity, which means it should protect the data from modification, insertion, deletion, and also replay. So therefore integrity also should be provided. Then you have got the service of authentication, which means that it ensures that the sender or the receiver of the information communicated. So which means that the sender and the receiver are supposed to communicate some messages between each other, and should kind of guarantee like build up the trust among each other that they are the person who are communicating and not being masqueraded by someone else. Okay, so therefore you kind of need to make your protocol or make your communication in a fashion that it's authenticated, like the user and the sender and the receiver are authenticated to each other. So the sender has a trust that it is really communicating to the intended receiver, and the receiver is also kind of convinced that it is actually receiving the information from the sender who is supposed, or rather who is authorized to communicate with it. So this is kind of quite an interesting field of this subject as well. And then you have got non-repudiation, which means that it protects by providing proofs against repudiation by either the sender or the receiver. We have seen what is meant by repudiation. And then you have got the topic of service of access control. So it basically provides protection against unauthorized use of data. So the common ways of providing access control is by saying the passwords, or by the PIN codes or other PIN numbers which you have. Okay, so you know that all of your ATMs you have got a PIN number. So basically that gives you an access control mechanism. Okay, so the basic mechanisms through which to obtain these security services or security goals, ITUT recommends some security mechanisms to provide the security services, and therefore what we see is that we have to consider the various mechanisms. So the mechanisms are as following. It is like encipherment, data integrity, digital signature, authentication exchange, traffic padding, routing control, notarization, and access control. So these are the various mechanisms through which these services are supposed to be provided to the user. So we shall consider each of these mechanisms one by one. So first comes the topic of encipherment. So this is the base, one of the significant portions of this particular course. We shall be considering the mechanisms of doing encipherment. So encipherment means broadly the hiding information by encryption or by something which we call as steganography. So steganography is a different thing, and what we will be essentially studying in this course is cryptography. But I will just give you a hint of what is meant by steganography. So it may be used, it may be used for other services also, along with other mechanisms like for authentication and non-repudiation. So therefore, the objective of encipherment, as we will be seeing in our course, is mainly to provide confidentiality or information, but also with other mechanisms, it also sometimes provides authentication or non-repudiation. So they also give, it also helps us in achieving the goals of authentication or non-repudiation. Then we have got data integrity. So therefore, in data integrity, the something which is being used commonly is a small checksum value for a message which is appended and sent. Okay, the receiver checks for the validity of the checksum, and that gives us a mechanism of obtaining data integrity. So this we shall also study in our course. So what I mean is like this. So therefore, imagine that Alice is sending an information to Bob, and it is sending the encrypted output of say 1000, okay, as we have seen in the previous example. So it is, for example, sending this 1000 XOR with the binary value of a key. And what Alice essentially, as we have seen, that this particular mechanism alone, although it's an encryption and provides confidentiality, does not give, or rather does not achieve the goal of integrity, okay, and therefore if can come in between and can modify this piece of information. So what is commonly done is, therefore, if I call this as the message which is being transferred, so this particular message is appended with a piece of information which is the output of a hash function, okay. So this is the typical, is a specially designed hash function which we call as the cryptographic hash function, which satisfies some properties, okay. So therefore you take this H and you apply it over the binary encoding of HC2, and you append it and send it along with the ciphertext, okay. So this is the actual information which is being transferred. So now imagine if Eve comes in between and modifies this information, then Bob will easily be able to detect, because suppose this information is being modified, then when Bob receives this information, Bob can apply the hash function H on this particular component of the text and can check whether it matches with this checksum, okay. And if it does not match, then Bob understands that there has been a sabotage of integrity done by an eavesdropper, okay, by an attacker. And therefore obviously you understand, or probably you have tried to think, started to think that this hash function should definitely satisfy some properties, okay, some cryptographic properties which are also being postulated, okay. Like for example, one thing probably which can come to your mind is that it should not be like easy to find out two values like this which hash to the same value, okay. So therefore what I mean is that it should not be easy to find out two C1 and C2 values which are not equal to each other, and the hash of HC12 is the same as the hash of HC2, okay. Because if this takes place, because if it is easy to find out such a piece of information, then the integrity of this is not really provided by this hash function. So the hash function should not essentially expose such kind of collision points, okay. So this is something which is called collision, and therefore the hash function should be something as we say as collision resistance. So I will come to these properties which the hash function should satisfy, but this is the basic scenario or basic objective for which these mechanisms are being developed, okay. So therefore data integrity, so therefore we can say, I mean, although it's not kind of so much well defined, but we can say that encryption alone is helpful to provide us confidentiality of information, but not necessarily integrity, okay. Integrity has to be taken, or rather tackled independently, and the mechanism of in cryptography which kind of gives us the, I mean rather satisfies or achieves the goal of integrity is something which is known as cryptographic hash functions, okay. And so we shall study in our course how to kind of design these, or rather achieve these mechanisms. So then comes the important topic of digital signature. So as we know that in our normal life, we know that if we have kind of made a will or kind of made a document and we kind of make a signature, the signature carries my bearance, right? That it's kind of an, so for example, if I have a check and I sign over that, it's a kind of authorization that it's okay, it's my signature, okay, that I essentially am granting this transaction, okay, I have a knowledge of this transaction. But in the digital world, when you have got large number of information being transferred over digitally, then also it will be quite nice if we can develop techniques which will help us to kind of digitally sign a piece of information, okay. And therefore we shall study in our course how to develop, rather how to electronically sign a piece of information, so that I can also sign and the receiver can kind of verify that it has really been signed by me, okay. So that also helps us in providing the, achieving the goals of integrity of information, okay, because it gives us authentication that it is really being, that this piece of information has got, if I am doing this transaction, the information which is being exchanged also carries this information that I have a knowledge of this transaction, okay. It is not like it is taking place without my knowledge. So then we also have this, as I told you, authentication. So therefore, two parties can exchange information to prove to each other that they are communicating, okay, that they are communicating among each other and not being masqueraded. So therefore, this is to stop masqueradings, okay, and therefore authentication is also a very important goal, and often digital signatures are used to obtain the goals of authentication. So therefore, so we shall also see, I mean, how or rather, so these are the broad mechanisms, okay, and therefore underlying these broad mechanisms we have called cryptographic modules. So various kind of things are working in underneath these broad mechanisms, and it's kind of the fascinating part of this subject is how to kind of develop, or rather how to kind of design these mechanisms, okay. So and we shall, as we shall see, is that a lot of mathematics and mathematical properties are also being used to develop these mechanisms, and that makes the subject quite interesting. So then we have got the techniques like traffic padding, like where we insert bogus data to prevent traffic analysis. So therefore, it could be like I just implant in bogus data so that the traffic analysis or a statistical analysis does not take place, okay. So a typical example could be like for example, there are some attacks which takes care of the timing information, okay. So it could be like there is a sender and there is a receiver, and what the attacker does is that the attacker tries to obtain the time of information, okay, like whether it is taking a longer time or it is taking a lesser time, and that often, or rather sometimes it has been found out, leaks the information about the secret, okay. So therefore, you can do analysis like this to ascertain the knowledge of the secret key. So what, and as a defense strategy, what you can do is that kind of do some bogus operation, or rather you send some kind of garbage data over the traffic, so that the time of the transaction is always a constant, okay, and therefore you cannot actually adopt these techniques to find out, or rather the timing techniques to adopt the key, okay. So therefore, this is just a very simple and a broad level, a very simplistic example to show you how you can actually, I mean, so you can actually plant in bogus data to prevent the traffic analysis of information. Then you have got routing control. So routing control means that there is a sender and the receiver, and there may be various channels through which you can actually pass information from the sender to the receiver, okay. So you could actually use all the information rather than sending through only one channel which can be eavesdropped. You can actually use, or rather switch and send the message over various channels, and therefore the task of the attacker will become harder, because the attacker now needs to kind of monitor large number of channels, okay, and therefore you can actually have practical security in a network kind of scenario. Then there is a concept of notarization. So notarization means that you essentially have a trusted third party to control the communication. So therefore, it could be like when a sender, say an Alice and a Bob, is communicating among each other, you have a trusted third party from where you obtain the tickets and where you obtain the keys and other things. So you can actually have, for example, if you would like to obtain the goal of non-repudiation, then what you can do, what the trusted third party can do is that the trusted third party always stores all the information which is being passed by, say, Alice, okay, and later on when Alice kind of denies, or rather Bob kind of denies a particular transaction, then Alice, the trusted third party can say no, that see that I have noted down these transactions, and these transactions prove that you have actually previously requested this transaction, and therefore now you cannot kind of refuse that you have not requested this transaction. So therefore, you can actually obtain repudiation, or rather non-repudiation, by having a trusted third party. But of course, that also adds to the cost of your communication. So then you have got access control, as I have told you that I mean, various ways of obtaining these access controls. There are various mechanisms through which access controls are obtained, and there are various password based schemes, and there are various pin based schemes through which access control is maintained or obtained in networks. So these are the various broad mechanisms, and the relationship between the services and the mechanisms are also interesting, and I believe that it's not so well defined, but we can actually have a fair amount of idea if we study this, as we have as is shown in this particular slide. For example, how do you obtain the service of confidentiality? Maybe through the mechanisms like encryption, and also maybe through routing control, like you keep on changing your routing so fast or so frequently that confidentiality is maintained. But what is more popular is, of course, encryption. That is, you make the piece of information unintelligible by using a piece of algorithm and a piece of secret key, and make the information unintelligible to a person who is not authorized to have an access to the information. And as we have seen, the other important service is integrity, and integrity is obtained by digital signature and maybe again encryption, because encryption used along with the other mechanisms sometimes also provides or rather achieves the service of integrity, and provides service of integrity, and therefore it's also commonly used. The other important service is that of authentication, which is achieved using encryption and digital signature. So as we have seen that digital signatures are used for integrity, it may also be used for authentication as well. So the other service is non-repudiation, which is obtained using digital signatures again, and also by notarization, as I have just now told you how you can obtain that, because a trusted third party can just keep on saving all the piece of information, storing the piece of information which are being transacted, and later on a denial later on can be kind of detected by the trusted third party. Then you have got access control, and this access control is achieved through something which is called as interactive proofs, and there are various access control mechanisms which are also being adopted, and also policies, like by laying out proper policies in the company or in the industry, you can also obtain access controls, and there are various works in these lines as well. So then we come into the something like what are the techniques which are adopted for this cryptographic algorithm. So what are the cryptographic algorithms? Okay, so therefore you have got a sender and you have got a receiver, and as we have seen that you have got a plain text message. For example, it's the plain text here is retreat at dawn, and there is an encryption algorithm, and there is a secret piece of information which encrypts this information and makes it something like this. Now this is kind of unintelligible to an attacker who sees this but really does not understand what is the piece of information. And then in the receiver end, what it does is that this is kind of decrypted, and this is decrypted by a piece of information, and this is decrypted and obtains the plain text, and then receives back, or rather extracts back the information. Now the question is like, what are the types of cryptographic algorithms which are existing? Okay, and there are broadly two types of cryptographic algorithms. One of them is called symmetric key ciphers, and the other one is called asymmetric key ciphers, and we shall be studying these in depth in our course. So in symmetric key ciphers, the sender and the receiver share the same piece of key for their message exchange. That is, when the sender is communicating with the receiver, as we have seen, there is an encryption key denoted by E, and there is a decryption key denoted by D. The encryption key and the decryption key are same. Okay, so therefore in a symmetric key environment, E and D are same. But there is something which is called the asymmetric key ciphers, and in this case the sender encrypts the message using a public key, and that is kind of public means that this key is known to everyone. Okay, so therefore this key E is known to everyone, so it exists in a public domain. But for decryption you have got a secret key, so it's called a private key, and therefore using this private key you obtain this piece of you obtain back the plain text, you recover back the plain text. Okay, therefore that concept means that in order to decrypt you need that secret piece of information, but everybody can encrypt. Okay, so therefore this is a very fascinating field of these cryptographic algorithms, which says that how you can actually do this asymmetric key ciphering. Okay, and it relies on various number theoretic and difficult problems which exists, or which are believed to exist. So then we have got hash functions, as I have told you. So it produces a small checksum for a large message. It is usually appended and sent with the message, and if the message is modified, then the receiver computes the hash value and checks for a match. Okay, so therefore this is again the topic of hash functions. Okay, and there are various cryptographic algorithms which are being developed by cryptographers. Like under the category of symmetric key ciphers, you have got popular algorithms like DES, AES, and other blowfish and so on. So these are kind of and there are stream ciphers and block ciphers. So we will see these categories as we proceed in our course. And another category of asymmetric ciphers, you have got RSA algorithms which are based on something we call L-gamma cryptographic systems. There are algorithms like elliptic curve crypto systems, which are also kind of which forms the standards under these asymmetric key ciphers. And under the category of hash functions, you have got large array of hash functions. Some of the popularly known hash functions are MD family hash functions, and then you have got the SHA hash functions and so on. Now we shall conclude our talk with something which is called steganography, because we will not really cover this in our course. So steganography is an interesting field which is like this word is derived from Greek, which means covered writing. The historical facts and myths exist about this study, and it's a simple method used by Romans and Greeks was, for example, to write on wood and then cover them with wax. Okay, so this is a very kind of primitive way of doing steganography. Some of the modern techniques could be like this, like you could actually cover a secret data, cover of a secret data could be a text. So therefore you can just consider this English statement like this is an example of steganography. Okay, so this is seemingly quite a simple English statement, but if you observe carefully you will find that the gaps between two words are not exactly the same. For example, here there is one single blank, but here there are two blanks, but here there is again one blank, here there are two blanks, here there are one blank. Okay, so now if you denote a single blank by a 0 and two blanks by 1, then you can actually say that there is a hidden message in this simple benignly looking text. It could be like 0 1 0 1 0. So therefore when you are, although you are communicating like this is an example of steganography, but actually what you are trying to communicate is this piece of information. Okay, so therefore this is a quite interesting way of obtaining confidentiality. So another modern technique could be like this, which is also quite interesting. The cover can be an image also, like a colored digitized image is represented by 3 bytes, and each byte is denotes red, blue, green pixels. Okay, so therefore you can have red, blue, green pixels, and the techniques for hiding a data in this image, it uses the fact that if you change the LSP, then it is not noticeable. Okay, so therefore if you take a digitized image and just change the LSP, then it is not noticeable. So therefore what you can do is that you can have a secret message, and secretly you can craft this message by modifying the LSP of the digital image, of the digitized image, and then transmit that. Now since you are changing the LSPs, it's not kind of visually, probably you cannot detect this change, but you can actually convey this message quite secretly. So there are several other more sophisticated techniques, but we shall not go into them, but I just wanted to kind of hint that there is also a kind of interesting topic of work which is called as steganography. So I shall give you some points to ponder like points to think on, like define the types. There are some examples which I have shown here, like define. So you are supposed to define the type of security attack, like a student steals the question paper. Okay, and another scenario could be like I buy a book through credit card for rupees 2000, but find that in my bank account rupees 4000 has been paid. So you have to just classify the type of security attack. The other scenario could be like one receives hundreds of emails from a colleague from an anonymous email account. Okay, so you have to, it's also, it would be interesting to think of possible security mechanisms to prevent these kind of attacks. So you can just think on what kind of mechanisms should you adopt to prevent these kind of security threats. So I conclude here, and the reference that I have used quite extensively is this book, Cryptography and Network Security by Farouzen of Tata McGraw Hills, and the next test topic shall be on an introduction to number theory. Thank you.